Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Thank you, Daniel. We're having a discussion at the very beginning of services. We were talking about the fact that unlike most parshiot, where the triennial division, right, dividing it up into three different sections is very, very clear. If you look in the Luach, it gives us two options for how to do the triennial reading for this week's Parsha. Option, actually B, the second one is how they listed here, is to divide it up the way that we normally would divide it up into thirds. And what it actually means is then that the Ten Commandments is only read in years 2 and 3 of the triennial cycle. We don't read the Ten Commandments in year number 1. Option letter A is to read the entire Parsha, which isn't a long Parsha, the entire Parsha every year, in spite of the fact that the rest of the Torah is being read on a triennial basis. There is one other Parsha that we do always read the full Parsha, and that is Ha'azinu. That's the blessing or the poem at the end, because it's impossible to divide that up. It doesn't make sense to divide that poem up. It's a single literary unit, and to divide that up makes no sense. So the reason I'm bringing this up today is because this isn't just about how much Torah we read. There's actually a philosophical underpinning to this conversation. If we choose, and we're on a triennial cycle, and we choose to read the entire Parsha, aren't we saying that the Ten Commandments is more important than any other part of the Torah? Is that a philosophical statement that we feel comfortable with? To say, we have to read the Ten Commandments every single year. By the way, it's in two different places in the Torah, both here in Exodus and in Deuteronomy. But we have to read it every year. We can't have a year 1 where we don't read the Ten Commandments when we get to this moment. So I'd like for us to think this morning, and I brought some sources. It's interesting where the rabbis went with this. What is your opinion? Should the Ten Commandments have a special status among the other mitzvot? If so, why? If not, why not? I will take positions on both sides of the aisle. Yes.
I think it should be read every year because that's the underlying underpinning of Judaism and the covenant and the bond with God. And to me, that's the most important part of the whole thing. It should be read every year to remind us of that.
Excellent. So Neil is saying it should be read. He's coming in on the we should read it every year side of the debate because he's arguing that it is the underpinning of Judaism, of our covenant with God, of our relationship with God, and therefore it should be read every single year. Okay? Anybody else want to weigh in?
I just want to ask you a question.
Go ahead.
And that is part of the reason we read this in its entirety because it's relatively short?
It is.
So if each row, maybe by coincidence, it happens to be short, so it makes sense to read it.
Yes, I think so. Bob brought up the question of, is one of the reasons that we do this because it's relatively short. And if it weren't short, if this were a really long Parsha, maybe it would have just been divided up and we would have read it only one time a year. Actually, the fact that it's relatively short allows us to, when you divide it up into thirds, allows us to kind of do it in the middle and then do the last year with the Ten Commandments at the very, very beginning. So we kind of read the Ten Commandments and go to the end of it. But yes, I think because it's short, that's part of the conversation. Angela.
Personally, I like reading them every year.
Angela's in favor of reading them, okay.
For why you might not is I believe that Judaism teaches that all mitzvot are equal
Right. All of the mitzvot are equal, but some are more equal than others. Right. Okay. So, I think, Angela, you're kind of on part of the conversation here, which is there are 613 commandments. Are we making an argument that these 10 are more important than the other 603? Right? And how do we know that these 10 are more important or not more important? All 613 of them are listed somewhere in the Torah, right? We've got them all there. Okay, yes, Diana.
So I think they're a little bit different in that, number one, when we do the public reading, which I'm a fan, I like doing it actually, we stand for them. So that shows like how incredibly important. I was thinking similarly to last week when we did Shirat Hayam, that's something that I believe we do. We don't skip that one either. We don't do the whole Parsha, but it's we always stand for that as well.
Correct.
These are like pivotal moments, and I think that really of the 613, or let's say these are 10, so we have 603 remaining. You can tie all of them to these 10 mitzvot somehow, and then there's a way like you can tie almost all of them to the most important one, which we might think is Shabbat or it's honoring your parents, but it's really don't steal. Because when you steal, you're stealing the honor, you're stealing
So you're making the argument that these 10 do have a certain level of importance that is a little bit different. First of all, we stand, when we were going to get back to that in a second, but that you can tie in the other mitzvot underneath sort of these and have these be archetypes almost, or paradigms for the other mitzvot. Let's get to the standing piece, which is very interesting. We do stand, and we will stand today. But Tshuvot Harambam, Maimonides, writes, V'chach ra'ui la'asot b'chol makom asher minhagam la'amod. Ra'ui lim'onam. This is fitting to do in any place where the practice is to stand for the 10 Commandments. It is fitting to prevent them from doing so, to prevent a loss of faith, that they would come to think that some parts of the Torah are more important than others. This is extremely problematic, he writes, and it is fitting to close any openings that would lead to this deficit of faith. So Rambam actually is arguing, no, not only do we not want to say that these are more important, but if the custom is in some communities to stand, we should stop people from doing that and say, no, we shouldn't stand. Now, by the way, he would argue that we wouldn't stand at the reading of the sea, crossing of the sea, right? Either you stand, and by the way, some people go the other way. There are some people who always stand for Torah readings. And they're taking Rambam, and they're saying, well, if it's all or nothing, then I'm going to do all. I'm not going to choose nothing. And they stand for they say every word of Torah is important. I'm going to stand for every aliyah. We don't see that here, but there are people who do that. So Rambam actually is coming in on the side of saying these 10 mitzvot, these 10 commandments, are actually not more important than anything else. And he's saying it creates a loss of faith. We're going to understand why he feels that in a second. Anybody else want to argue as to why for or against? Jane.
If you actually look at them, if you analyse the 10 commandments, some of them are fundamental to the sanctity of life. That you should not burn.
Right.
And so I think because of how they're weighted, these are I'm not saying that the other mitzvot aren't important, but these are the heavy-hitting, heavy-weighted ones. And I wonder if we have to repeat more just because of how they're weighted.
So Jane is making the argument that if we look and analyze these 10 commandments, right, these 10 utterances, right, by the way, they're not called 10 commandments. That's what we call them. They're called Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 utterances, right? That's actually what they're called. But these are heavy hitters. These are don't murder and don't steal and don't commit adultery. These are fundamental to how we live life and can live life. And maybe, therefore, they should be given more weight because of that, or have been given more weight because of that. So it's really an interesting... Oh, please, go ahead.
Just to reinforce what Dave was saying, the reality is that most people don't follow every mitzvah. So if you're going to choose some to follow, maybe those are the ones that you really should make sure you do at least those.
Interesting. So the reality is that most people don't follow all 613 mitzvot. And so if you have to make a decision, you're arguing, right? Choose these. Start with these, right? And then move your way into other ones. Okay. Now, what's interesting is that our Talmud actually argues against that. And they argue against it in the following way. In Masechet Brachot, page 12a, the Gemara related that the priests in the temple used to read the Ten Commandments along with sections of the Shema, V'haya im shamoa, Vayomer, Emet ve'emunah, Avodah, and the priestly blessings. So that was sort of the liturgy that the Kohanim in the temple used to do, right? A lot of the prayers that we know, some of those central prayers, the Shema, and some of these other prayers, and the Ten Commandments were part of the liturgy at the time. Shmuel said, even in outlying areas outside the temple, they sought to recite the Ten Commandments in this manner every day. Right? That's what used to happen. But they abolished the recitation of the Ten Commandments due to the grievance of the heretics. What does this mean? The grievance of the heretics. Let's see what it says here. Tarumot haminin, right? The charges, the accusations of the heretics. What are they talking about? So they're actually talking probably about early Christianity. Because Christianity at its essence comes and argues mitzvot are not important. Right? The mitzvot have been replaced and supplanted by belief in Jesus. That's the argument that at least John and John's form of Christianity at the time takes. However, Christians still saw the Ten Commandments and still do see the Ten Commandments as fundamental. So the argument that early Christians, and I would argue sometimes Christians today, would say is, these 10 are important, the other 603 are not. And as a response to that, the rabbis of the Talmud, which remember, the Talmud is now between 200 and 500. So Christianity has already started to be established and already started to form, right? That their response is to say, no, we're not going to hold these 10 above all the rest. All 613 are important. And we're not going to argue that these 10 do. And I would say that's why Rambam later on also said we don't highlight these 10 as being more important. All of them are important. What are your thoughts on that? Agree? Disagree? Yeah?
I don't know that they're more important, but it's the first, like I said before, significant covenant with God ourselves. So they're not going to be more important, but it establishes something. Maybe it establishes the rest of them.
So Neil is going back is that we're not arguing that they're more important, but that they're establishing this relationship in sort of in a powerful way. Okay?
The Ten Commandments are core directives to behavior, but we live life every day in a lot of other mitzvot and precepts that come from the Torah. Fair weights and measures, justice, not putting a stumbling block before the blind. All these things that tell us how we're supposed to live in the world and the community, and they're very important in our daily life as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of very important sections of the Torah in terms of how we treat one another and fair weights and measures and how we relate to other human beings that are very, very important. And you can make an argument that it's just as important. I mean, obviously, do not murder, pretty important. You can't worry about fair weights and measures and things like that if you're killing people, okay? But this in and of itself, right, you would argue, living your life by the Ten Commandments doesn't make you a Jew. It may make you a good person. And actually, quite a number of the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach, right, the 7 Noahide commandments that non-Jews are supposed to observe, are in the 10 Commandments, right? Not all of them, but quite a number of them, of the 7, right? And so it makes you a good person. It doesn't necessarily make you a good Jew. The only one that's in this that is specifically Jewish is Shabbat. Every other one is universal, or could be. Don't steal, don't murder, don't covet, right? You could argue that I am the Lord your God and you shall have no other gods before me. You could argue that that's Jewish, but you could also argue that that's Christian and Muslim as well are keeping that, right? The observance of Shabbat is the only one of the 10 Commandments that is specifically Jewish. And even then, it broadens it because it says you and your servants and everyone who lives in your community should keep Shabbat, even if they're not Jewish. So the 10 Commandments in and of themselves are not Jewish doctrine. It's everything else that is added into all of that becomes Jewish doctrine. So, why do we read it? I tend to agree with Neil. I'm going to reframe it a little bit differently, right? The story of our relationship culminates with this moment, right? I don't think we should be reading the 10 Commandments by themselves. I agree the 10 Commandments should not be part of liturgy. Because if we just read the 10 Commandments by themselves, then we're thinking of them as 10 laws disconnected from the story in which they occur. But the reason we stand here and we read the entire thing, and we were discussing, Milton and I were discussing some of the beautiful imagery in this story, right? Is the whole story as a whole is important. It's a story not about the commandments, it's a story about the relationship. The relationship between us and God. And the commandments are the sign of that relationship. Every covenant has an agreement and a sign to that agreement, right? The first one with Abraham, actually the first one with Noah, had an agreement not to destroy the world, and the sign was the rainbow. The second one with Abraham had an agreement that Abraham would be the father of a nation, and the sign is circumcision, the Brit Milah, right? This covenant that we have standing at Mount Sinai, the sign is Torah. That's the sign, right? That's what binds it. But it's the relationship, it's the covenant that we're standing for. That's why knowing the halacha back and forth, right? And I mean, far be it from me to go against Rambam, right? But we stand here during the 10 Commandments not because of the 10 Commandments in and of themselves, but because they represent a culmination of this story. we're standing to recreate the moment at Mount Sinai. We're not standing because these mitzvot are important. We're standing because we stood at Mount Sinai, and we're remembering that story. We're remembering that moment, and we're capturing these words in that moment. Any questions or comments before we actually read through our parasha today, which will include the Ten Commandments? Angela? We do. We do. We do, because that's the moment that we were standing at Mount Sinai. Right? We weren't standing for all 3 days and stuff like that of everything, right? That was the moment, that was that critical moment that we were standing as we were hearing these words come down. And then, of course, what are the words that were said at Mount Sinai? Is it just the Ten Commandments? Is it the whole Torah? Is it the Torah and the Talmud, right? Depending on your denominational background, you may have a different view of what was given at Mount Sinai, but it's that moment of those words that we were standing at Mount Sinai. So yes, time-wise it's the same, but I guess the reason I'm saying this is as we stand today, it's a good way to close, as we stand today, we're not standing because of these words. We're standing because we stood at Sinai and we entered in that relationship, and so we stand today to reconfirm that relationship. All right, Shabbat Shalom.